Welcome to the Pacific Northwest Geodesign Forum. I'm Tim Nyergis, Professor of Geography and Director of the Masters of GIS for Sustainability Management. I'd like to take this opportunity this morning for thanking you all for signing up, registering, being here this morning at this early hour. Hopefully a number of other people will arrive in due time, as it would be. And I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the sponsors of the activity. This event wouldn't occur, at least the students, for there is a free lunch in the world every now and again for students. Students didn't have to pay a registration fee. So the 4 colleges from the University of Washington came together, or at least units, I should say, from 4 colleges came together. The College of Arts and Sciences, with the Department of Geography and the Division of Social Sciences, the Master of GIS Program for Sustainability Management within the Department of Geography. From the College of Built Environments, we have Landscape Architecture and Urban Design and Planning that are part of the Planning Committee. From the College of Engineering, we have Civil and Environmental Engineering. And as engineers, sometimes, as it would be, I'm a geographer, a would-be engineer, as the case would be, I think, all these years. The engineers sometimes have a little bit deeper pockets. They didn't even want to bother to go to their dean for money because they had enough to contribute themselves. So that was quite nice for the faculty to get together and do that. From the College of the Environment, we have the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. And last but not least, the National Science Foundation funded project. It's called the Cyber GIS Project. It goes by the formal title of Software Integration for Sustained Geospatial Innovation.
Try to spur this along, be pretty quick with this since we're a little bit behind schedule. So I'm going to talk about the Puyallup-White Watershed. As Nancy indicated, we're doing a regional plan, but we're having to go watershed by watershed in doing some of the analysis. And we started with the Puyallup Watershed, and that turned out to be a pretty good pretty good selection because we were able to work from people that had worked with before. The Pierce County Open Space Task Force Group had already looked at their open space resources and began to put their own priorities, mostly at the local level. Our job was to take this information that they had done and put it back into a more regionally scaled set of projects that would then relate back up to the regional scale where we would evaluate those and come up with a set of priorities at the regional level. So in taking the work that they had done and moving forward, we had the following questions. What are the most beneficial measures that we could take to create an interconnected, robust, multifunctional open space system? What are the most important things we could do? And then how do we evaluate those to set those priorities? And then how do we integrate those activities and set them into a strategic plan? So here's our process in a nutshell. I tried to put it within the geodesign framework and that Steinitz puts forward, and looking at how geographic services and design activities were combined, and you can kind of see how both sets played into this. So first we organized a watershed advisory group that would direct us in the effort. Then we compiled background information. There had been a lot of background information. Of course, a lot of it was based on GIS information services. We then, based on the design part of that, based on that input and input from the folks that really had been working in this field in the watershed, came up with a series of open space proposals, which we then reviewed and refined, integrated into a strategy. And then, as you see towards the bottom there, we are in the process of evaluating those open space proposals, particularly with respect to ecosystem and open space services that they provide. And Jenny's going to talk about that. 2 outcomes from this effort. One are those priorities that then go into the regional planning, the green thing that you see over there, which will require further GIS-based analysis. But the other thing that came out in the blue box that you see was the fact that some of these activities, even though they're not meant to be accomplished at the local level, folks at the local level got behind them and started to think, hey, if we think about this strategically, we can begin to effect some of these projects early on. So looking back at the process a couple more times, we did the background information, a lot of that had been compiled, but not in a way we could use it. What we found was that the data sets didn't match up, and there was a lot of difficulty in actually bringing the GIS tools to bear early on in the process. So when we got to the design aspects, when we started to sort these things through and look at what the priorities were and how we might assemble those into a strategy, again, we weren't working specifically with those GIS tools. We had the paper maps, and they worked just fine, just like McHarg did in 1965, but we didn't have the system that we did. We didn't have what Mike talked about, that close coupling of the information services and the design processes together. That was something we hope to improve in the next watershed that we do. So I'll go through this really, really quickly. Here's a few of the outcomes that we had when we looked at basically 4 systems that Nancy talked about, the ecosystems that we were talking, primarily boiled down to aquatic systems. And we found through this analysis that the White River that you see up here was really the really critical one, even more than the Puyallup River. We found also that there was areas within the urbanized area of Pierce County that actually still retained, because they were in the floodplains, they still retained rural activities and open space, and they were incredibly important to the ecology of the whole watershed. So we began to sort through that and think about how they could be assembled, and activities to protect them were taken. Within that area, we found that one of the key setback levees that had been identified was in that area, and we looked at that in more specifics. It became very clear that was a high priority because it provided not only flood hazard reduction, but also the critical intertidal habitat was very necessary for the very rare spring run Chinook thing that they have. Looking at the larger watershed, went back and found that where the Green River that you see on the top of the slide there has been largely protected, the White River to the lower left, equally ecologically important, had very little protection along its banks. So we started to talk about some of the activities that could be done to protect that. When we looked at the ecosystem through biodiversity lens, found very much the same thing, that these two things kind of compiled. Again, you see that you don't see one map that shows these together because we didn't have that particular aspect of that. But then, and I can see we're running short of time, so I'm just going to go through these really, really quickly here. The information looked at working landscapes and agricultural lands. The information was pretty much there, not in a form that we could really use it very effectively. But what we found out anyway was it wasn't so much the geographic aspects of this, the technical aspects. It was getting all the folks that were working on this issue together. It was more of an organizational issue that was keeping activities from happening there. Same thing with the working forest. That really the activity that came out as the most important was to facilitate an interagency forest management strategy, get the state, the feds, the counties, and the municipalities all on the same page on that. So in terms of health and active living, there was spaghetti diagrams of trails that people wanted all over the region. What we found when we really kind of looked at this more critically was there's just a few trail lengths that if we could connect just these ones that are shown in red here, we could have a system that goes all the way from Seattle to Tacoma, then up to Gig Harbor and around the Kitsap Peninsula, and then down to Rainier, building on what was already there. So again, it was just kind of a visual analysis that showed us these were really critical points. And we also found that, looking at some other data, that it was also an area that was poor in recreational activities, that the access for folks in this area, largely lower income, didn't have that. So again, it pointed out to the fact that we could really make this work. In terms of community development, the last element, what we found was that there was an awful lot of things happening around Mount Rainier National Park, and also a lot of the communities were struggling trying to rebuild their economy with tourism-based work. So we kind of put that together and said, if we had a coalition, Greater Rainier Coalition, just like they have in the Greater Yellowstone Coalition or the Gorge Commission, we could really magnify that. And what really became important with that was that the county council is starting to get excited about that. They don't care necessarily so much about conservation, at least that's what it seems. But economic development, yes. And so here's where we're combining those two things to get some some more activity going on in there. When we blurred our eyes, and this is really quick, I'm sorry for being so quick on this, but when we looked back and looked at the map and said, you know, there's these geographically linked strategies. Yeah, all these activities are good in themselves, but when you put them together, they really match up. For example, this kind of green heart that I talked about just right in the center of the urbanized area, if you add that to the agricultural lands, you really get a set of green open spaces and resources that shape the urban environment there. It could be the one gem of this whole kind of sprawling area that you see in northern Pierce County. Similarly, the White Corridor, which I've already talked about, and the Greater Rainier Coalition, which was very, very important and moving forward faster than we ever thought it would. So one thing that comes out of that I'd like to talk about just really briefly is the notion that Brian and Bill brought up earlier on, is that a lot of the stuff that we need to talk about is not necessarily just geographic system, but it's how organizations work. So if you look at, and I'm proposing here kind of a silly thing, as complement to geodesign is organodesign. So as we're looking at physical technologies in geodesign, we need to look at social technologies, the decision processes, the institutional organization, the cultural norms, those kinds, and the values. Those are the things that really are kind of keeping us from doing a lot of the stuff that we want to do here. Geodesign looks at the physical landscape. We need to look at the institutional landscape. Information and recommendations come out of geodesign. Really, when you look at this other aspect, it's the decisions and actions that we need to kind of work on. So I think a lot of people would say, well, you know, that right side really is part of geodesign. But, you know, if that's the case, then that's really where we need to focus. Because while we've had, you know, Mike talked about all the extensive recent advancements in geodesign, man, there's not been that commensurate advancements on how our institutions work and how we make our decisions and function as a society. So just throw that out there. But I'm going to get back to the main act here. We're going to talk a little bit about evaluation right at the end, and I'm going to make it really quick so I can give Jenny some time here because I know we're running short. Jenny.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to focus here on this third aspect of evaluation. I worked directly with the environmental management graduate students, but we had contributions from geography classes as well. And so they were exploring a couple of ways for actually analyzing the impacts of our proposed actions, right? And so they looked at spatially explicit models and then also expert opinion surveys. And the spatially explicit models, we focused on using INVEST software, which was developed by the Natural Capital Project. This software includes about 16 modules, 16 different models for ecosystem services, although they're always adding more. And these models are based on production functions. They calculate the potential of ecosystems to provide benefits under different ecological conditions. And their theoretical and mathematical underpinnings are pretty well described in this book recently published, as well as a number of scientific publications. So you see there are quite a few services you can assess with this software. So the students really just tried modeling a handful of them. And part of the benefit of using this particular software is that not only is it free and open source, but it's intended by the Natural Capital Project to be embedded within this larger process, which is basically what our project is already doing. We start with stakeholder engagement and use these stakeholders to develop objectives as well as scenarios or potential future alternatives. And then those scenarios help define the inputs into your biophysical and your economic models. And then when you look at your outputs, you can see maps really stand out. These are spatially explicit models. Maps are very important outcomes. This is an example map created by one of the graduate students. This shows carbon sequestration across a watershed. We didn't actually have the proposals John just discussed prepared at the time that the students were doing this work, so they worked at the watershed scale. So you can see this is a very detailed output. It does require quite a bit of data, expertise, time, labor to create this kind of thing. So the students at this point decided to look into other ways of valuing ecosystem services, and that's actually what drove this development of an expert opinion survey. which they called VEST, which stood for Valuing Ecosystem Services Together. And this is really just an Excel spreadsheet. Across the top, we have a list of investment areas that could also be any kind of proposed action. And across the left-hand side, we have a list of ecosystem services. Something like this is flexible enough you can add any kind of benefit or service, any kind of human equity, human health, anything like that. And so the people taking the survey using this Excel sheet then use numbers to basically assign value for the different investment areas to the ecosystem services. So they're defining that relationship. And as the name implies, we're working together with many stakeholders, many people taking the survey, and bringing all of that expert-based opinion together. And with the little color scheming the students used here, you can see kind of hot spots of where we have the experts valuing our different actions in their provision of our ecosystem services. So there are pluses and minuses to both methods. The spatially explicit models are very time and labor intensive. They do cost a lot of money because of this. However, you get very good, detailed, scientifically rigorous outputs. The expert-based surveys are nice because of their flexibility and because you get to include opinions from a diverse group of stakeholders. But it can be hard to get that many people participating as well. And unless you're really good at defining your criterion and defining what you have on your Excel spreadsheet, your results can be pretty hard to interpret sometimes. It can be a little fuzzy. So in the end, what the students recommended was actually a combination of their two methods, perhaps starting with that expert-based opinion, something like our VEST survey, to find those hot spots of where the experts are really valuing proposed actions, and then narrowing in, focusing in on those particular areas, those ecosystem services, and perhaps modeling them with perhaps Invest software, could be other software too, and then really getting that detailed output, especially the spatially explicit output that could be so important in this planning process. Okay, so I think we actually sped along quite nicely at the end there. And so we'd like to acknowledge all of our funders and thank all the graduate students. And at this time, I think we have time for questions and comments.
Yeah, that's correct. We're going to have a whole section when all of the speakers from this morning come up and open it up for a general question and answer session. So, great job.